Hello and welcome back to AP Psych's Unit 7. This is a unit on personality development. So in this last video, I'm going to be covering both the behaviorist and the biological perspectives. This is a total of 2 perspectives in the video and 4 people. So three for the behaviorist perspective and 1 for the biological. So we'll start first with the behaviorist perspective. Behaviorism is a topic that we last referenced in the unit on learning, like Skinner, Pavlov, Watson, ideas of conditioning and model learning. But the behaviorist perspective here for personality is a little similar. It's the theoretical orientation based on the premise that scientific psychology should be studying only observable behaviors. So this is very opposite of Freud and the psychodynamic field with the internal mental events. Now we're talking about things that you can actually see. The behaviorists were pretty new to studying personality. They really didn't start studying it until there were some guys who tried to transmit the work of Freud into behavioral terms, and it wasn't really working out that great. So the big idea people in this unit are going to become B.F. Skinner, Albert Bandura. Both of those guys are from previous units. And then thirdly and lastly, Walter Mischel. All right, so let's take a look first with B.F. Skinner's pure behaviorism. Pure behaviorism is purely focusing on conditioning and the idea of determinism. So this is an idea that behavior is 100% fully determined by environmental stimuli. You don't have any free will at all. In fact, quoting Skinner, free will is an illusion. B.F. Skinner, really popular psychologist, voted most influential of the 20th century by many psychologists. But the idea of pure behaviorism is just saying, how do we respond behaviorally to our environments? So the environments mold our overt behaviors, and our personality is then defined by a collection of response tendencies, which is just how do you respond when there's stimulation across various environments and situations. And so this is a very operant conditioning point of view to take. You're going to strengthen certain responses through getting reinforcement. It's going to continuously develop over the course of your life. And a lot of these things can happen in a very mechanical, primitive level without your actual knowledge of your participation. So when you're getting reinforced for things, you may not realize it. When you're being punished for things, you may not realize it. But this is going to have an impact on your personality and how you start to respond across various situations. So this is a determinism. Behavior, again, is fully determined by environmental stimuli. And that's B.F. Skinner, pure behaviorism. Next, we have Albert Bandura. He's actually going to give us 2 contributions. So Albert Bandura's legacy is tied up a lot in the social cognitive theory. Social learning theory has been another name for this. And basically, he's a behaviorist, of course, but he does add this kind of secondary perspective of cognition, the cognitive flavor to behaviorism sometimes as it's presented. And basically, he just wants to say that, we're human beings. We are conscious thinking beings. We can't ignore the fact that we consciously think about stuff. And so our personality, while it's largely shaped through learning, it's not happening so passively and so mechanically like B.F. Skinner coined. And so he argued for something called reciprocal determinism, which is basically to say that it goes both ways. There are internal mental events and external environmental factors and overt behavior that can all influence one another. So simply, the environment, it does determine behavior, but behavior can also determine the environment. And I would challenge you to think about some examples for this. Certainly, you might have a situation, if we're talking about students, how could student behavior impact the classroom versus how does the classroom impact student behavior? In a typical classroom, you may have rules, and it's expected that everybody follows those rules. So the classroom school environment sets rules in place. It's supposed to have an impact on student behavior. Of course, ideally it does, but not always, just being honest. But for the most part, that environment has regulations and rules that determines what's acceptable behaviors and what's not, okay? But what about student behavior also determining the environment? So for example, if you have a kid who acts one way in one class, which totally changes the dynamic of that classroom setting and environment versus acting differently in another class, how does it change the setting there? Okay, there's other stuff I'm sure you could think about, but this is the core idea. The other contribution from not B.F. Skinner, Albert Bandura, is the idea of self-efficacy. So of course he also, just to review, contributed observational learning to kind of go against straight up conditioning and say that modeling is also a factor, but that's not a new concept presented now. So self-efficacy is defined by one's belief about your ability to perform a behavior that should lead to an expected outcome. So you could have a high degree of self-efficacy, you could have a low degree of self-efficacy. Sometimes this is a word linked with the idea of having a confidence in a successful outcome, or a high confidence or low confidence into a certain expected outcome. Certainly, we're going to go into many different situations in life where we're going to go in with that high self-efficacy. We feel confident about our ability to perform and lead to a certain outcome. And other times where maybe we don't, and that's okay, very normal. But this is another contribution by Albert Bandura in the realm of personality development. All right, and then the third and final person for the behaviorist perspective is a guy who recently passed away named Walter Mischel. He has often been associated with a couple of things, one being the person situation controversy, another being the famous marshmallow test, which anytime I mention this now, people always remember that one instead of this. So let's try to focus on the person situation controversy. The person situation controversy is basically defined by just saying that there are situational factors that impact and govern behavior, and people always make responses that they think are going to lead to reinforcement in the situation at hand. But we do not act the same way in all situations. For example, if you are considering yourself an honest student, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be an honest employee. Now, there's a good chance that you might be, but are you the same person across all environments? That's the basic thing you should think about. So the person situation controversy is basically just going to say people are not going to necessarily behave the same way in different situations. So they behave differently across certain environments, across certain situations. And in the end, our takeaway is that personality is just a little bit less consistent than we previously assumed. You know, your student who may, or your friend who may be a really honest person in a friendship with you, may not be an honest friend to another person. They might actually violate that person's trust. Or someone who I might consider a very honest student at school could be the same person who steals from their job to make some extra money on the side. Now, I'm not getting into their motivations for that. I'm just saying it's a possibility. All right, so that's a person situation controversy. If you're curious, since I mentioned it, about the marshmallow test, it's basically a test of self-control and delayed gratification. So Walter Mischel's long-term research study has basically suggested that people who delay eating a marshmallow in favor of getting a second marshmallow later have a greater sense of delayed gratification control. And if they have that, he's linked it to things like vocational success and life success if people continue on that same path to delay certain gratifications, to really think about them more consciously and logically and how it could impact them in a better way. So that's a marshmallow test. Again, you can look into it. Mischel wrote a book about this a couple years ago, and it's a fascinating story. All right, just overall evaluating the behaviorist perspective. There's pros and cons for both sides, but you can look at the pros there for each person individually and what their contribution was to the overall behavioral perspective. And then the criticisms, okay? Some of the criticisms deal with the dehumanizing nature of radical behaviorism, looking at the idea like, oh, things happen mechanically. There's no human involvement into that, at least until you get to Albert Bandura's version, the reciprocal determinism. So there's that to think about, but let's go ahead and shift gears to the last topic, which is personality theory from the biological perspective. All right, so the biological perspective has one individual, very difficult name here, Hans Eysenck. Okay, if you butcher it, it's fine. I might be butchering it. But Hans Eysenck's theory is the hierarchy of traits, not to be confused with the hierarchy of needs, which is humanistic. So the hierarchy of traits is going to add on one new personality trait. So overall, if you remember the 5 of them from the trait theorist perspective under the big 5 personality traits, we're adding on one final trait now. That gives you a total of 6 traits from this unit that you should be somewhat familiar with. So the hierarchy of traits is to suggest that your personality emerges from 3 traits, which is extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Okay, so extroversion is still the same. It's the grouping of positive emotions. Neuroticism is still the same. It's those negative emotions, but the negative emotions that are within. So things like anxieties, being self-conscious, could be hostility. But psychoticism is the new one, so we want to separate that. Psychoticism is basically a personality trait that then impacts other people. Okay, so when you are egocentric or you can only think about your own point of view and not someone else's. When you're impulsive towards others or cold towards others or antisocial towards others, meaning you don't really care how your actions impact other people, that is psychoticism. Apologies about my dog barking in the background. Hans Eysenck's theory overall is to say that personality is determined to a large by a person's genes. That's the main takeaway, just that genetics have an influence on your personality. Again, hierarchy of traits. And he comes up with this by basically discovering introverts being more easily conditioned, especially in regards to the inhibitions of bashfulness and tentativeness and an uneasiness socially. Okay, so hopefully my dog's barkings weren't too loud. I'm not editing any of these videos, so this is life. And that's all I got for you. This is the conclusion of Unit 7B, or Unit 7 now in general. As always, thanks for watching. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Adios.